All rise. This court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson presiding. Please be seated. Now calling criminal case number 4046, the People versus Stephen Reynolds.
Good morning. Are both sides prepared for trial?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ready, Your Honor.
All right, we will begin with opening statements.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you in advance for your service. Now, on the night of September 14th, a much admired coach and teacher, Mr. Randy Johnson, was shot and murdered just outside one of our high schools. Now, this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. This was cold-blooded murder. Now, over the course of this trial, you will learn that the defendant, Stephen Reynolds, had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit this murder. Moreover, you will hear just how enraged he was at Coach Johnson, how he felt the coach had stolen something from him and his family, and how he had physically confronted Coach Johnson just a short while before the murder. Now, September 14th started off as a great day. There was a high school football game, and Coach Johnson was on the sidelines leading the Panthers to another hopeful victory. But early in the second quarter, he benched senior quarterback Noah Reynolds, Stephen Reynolds' son. Noah wasn't having a good game. But the defendant did not take this decision well. In fact, you will learn he started screaming and yelling at the coach. He even went so far as to rush onto the field and grab the coach's arm. Even then, he didn't calm down. He continued yelling and screaming at the coach throughout the rest of the game. Now, at about 9:30, when the game ended, the defendant left the stadium, and he claims he went home and he was home alone for the rest of the evening. But you'll hear there's no witnesses to back this up. There's no phone calls to trace his whereabouts. 90 minutes later, around 11 o'clock at night, Coach Johnson leaves the stadium, goes to the parking lot, and bam, bam, shots ring out. Coach Johnson is dead. So what happened in those 90 minutes between when the enraged defendant leaves the stadium and when Coach Johnson is left to die alone? How do we determine this? We will use the same three things that jurors, prosecutors, and the police have always used: motive, means, and opportunity. Motive. As you heard, the defendant was furious at the coach. He believed the coach had taken away his son's chance at a college scholarship, and he was not going to take that sitting down. Means. You will hear from the police that the defendant owned a gun, and the caliber of the bullets in that gun were an exact match with the caliber of the bullets that murdered Coach Johnson. 3, opportunity. You will hear that there was more than enough time for the defendant to drive from the stadium back to his home to retrieve his gun, and then back again to the stadium parking lot where he could lie in wait for the coach. Ask yourselves, who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity? Who was furious at the coach right before the murder took place? Ladies and gentlemen, sadly, Coach Johnson is not here to speak for himself. He was silenced forever. So it is up to us, to you, and to me to speak for him. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, contrary to the prosecution's assertion, it is not up to you to speak for Randy Johnson. Your role is to determine if the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Stephen Reynolds murdered Randy Johnson. And the evidence in this case will show that the prosecution cannot meet that burden. Stephen Reynolds is not the cold-blooded killer that the prosecution would have you believe. Stephen Reynolds is a loving father, a devoted father. Stephen Reynolds is an upstanding member of our community. Coach Johnson, on the other hand, is not. Coach Johnson led a double life. Coach by day, gambling addict by night. Coach Johnson lost his home. Coach Johnson sold his wife's car because of his gambling addiction. Coach Johnson was indebted to a known loan shark, Jeffrey Jenkins, who made threats against the coach's life, and the prosecution didn't even investigate him. The prosecution bears the burden of proof. They must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Stephen Reynolds committed this crime, and they just can't do it. One, the prosecution does not have the murder weapon. They don't have the gun. Not a thorough investigation. The bullet that killed Randy Johnson could have been fired by any number of guns other than Stephen Reynolds' gun. And most importantly, the prosecution cannot put Stephen Reynolds at the scene of the crime. They got the wrong guy. The prosecution bears the burden of proving that beyond a reasonable doubt that Stephen Reynolds killed Randy Johnson, and they cannot do it. And under our law, if the prosecution cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Stephen Reynolds committed this crime, you must find Stephen Reynolds not guilty. Thank you.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Ms. Brown, will you please state for the record your name and what you do at the high school?
My name is Rebecca Brown, and I am a high school senior and the team manager for the Panthers varsity football team.
And what are your responsibilities as the team manager?
Basically, I make sure every game runs smoothly. I set out all the equipment for the players. I let them know who should be coming in next and who should be warming up. Also, I clean up all the equipment and put it away at the end of the game.
Are you on the sidelines during every game?
Yes, I'm typically right next to Coach during every game, even his last game.
Well, let's talk about that last game. Do you remember seeing the defendant, Stephen Reynolds, at that game?
Yes, he was hard to miss. He was upset because Coach benched Noah, so he was coming down from the sidelines as if he was going to punch Coach.
Objection, speculation.
Sustained. The jury should disregard that statement. Ms. Brown, please only testify to what you actually saw or heard and not your opinion of what happened.
Ms. Brown, let me ask you this. Did you see the defendant touch Coach Johnson during the game?
Yes. Coach and I were walking back to the locker room during halftime, and Mr. Reynolds came down, grabbed Coach's arm, and started yelling at him.
What was he yelling?
He was saying that Coach was going to be sorry that he benched Noah because scouts weren't going to see him on the bench.
What scouts are you referring to?
A scout from Maryland was there. Everyone was talking about it.
Let's move now to after the game. About what time did you leave the stadium?
Well, the game was over at about 9:30, and by the time I was done cleaning up all the equipment, I got back to my car at about 11.
And when you went to your car, did you see anything in the parking lot?
I saw two men talking, not yelling exactly, but arguing.
Could you recognize either man?
I recognized Coach Johnson because he wears this jacket to every game that says Coach on the back. And I couldn't recognize the other man, but he was about the size of Mr. Reynolds.
What happened next?
Then I got into my car and I heard two gunshots and I immediately called 911.
Did you go back to see what happened?
Did I go back to where the gunshots were coming from? Of course not. Do I look stupid?
No, Ms. Brown, you absolutely do not. Thank you very much for painting such a vivid picture of what happened. No further questions.
Your witness, counselor.
Ms. Brown, wasn't Coach Johnson acting a bit strange during the game?
Well, he did seem a little distracted. He kept checking his phone, even during plays.
Now, I want you to think back to that night. Think back to the parking lot. Could you see either man's face that night?
No, it was too dark.
And you couldn't hear what they were saying either, could you?
No.
So couldn't they have been talking about anything, even Coach Johnson's outstanding gambling debt?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation.
Sustained. Rephrase or move on.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Detective Bennett, Will you please tell the jury what happened on the night of September 14th?
I received a call from the 911 dispatcher at about 11:07 p.m. that gunshots were fired near the high school. When I arrived at approximately 11:15 p.m., I found a man who was later identified as Coach Randy Johnson. He was dead upon my arrival and was suffering from a gunshot wound to the chest.
And what did you do next?
I established a perimeter around the crime scene and tracked down some witnesses. Several students mentioned there had been an earlier altercation between Coach Johnson and Mr. Stephen Reynolds. So I went over to Mr. Reynolds' house to ask him a few questions.
And what did the defendant tell you?
Mr. Reynolds confirmed that he had been in an argument during the game with Coach Johnson and that he had gone home directly after. But this couldn't be corroborated because he was home alone.
Was there sufficient time on the night of the murder for the defendant to have traveled from the stadium back to his home and then back again to the stadium parking lot to commit the crime?
Yes, there was. I've traveled that route, and Mr. Reynolds had plenty of time to do that.
Did the defendant own any firearms?
Yes, Mr. Reynolds said he was a registered gun owner, but that gun had been missing for several weeks.
It was missing. Did you ask the defendant why he didn't report the gun as missing?
Yes, he said he had misplaced it and assumed that it would reappear.
It would just reappear. Detective, is it possible that this missing gun was in fact the murder weapon?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness is not a weapons expert.
Withdrawn. Let me put it this way. Detective, what type of gun did the defendant own?
He owned a Glock 19, which fires 9mm bullets.
9mm. And what caliber of bullet was used to murder Coach Johnson?
Also a 9mm.
The exact caliber as the gun that the defendant now claims just conveniently vanished right before the murder.
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
Withdrawn. Thank you, Detective. No further questions.
Do you have any cross-examination, counsel?
Just a few questions, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Detective, you said that the bullet that killed Mr. Johnson was a 9mm bullet, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, isn't a 9mm bullet one of the most common bullet sizes in the world?
Yes, it is.
So that means that a number of guns, other than Stephen Reynolds' gun, could have been the gun that fired that bullet, right?
I suppose it's a very common bullet size.
Is there any physical evidence that Stephen Reynolds' gun was the murder weapon?
Physical evidence? No.
Detective Bennett, did you investigate any other suspects?
No, there were no other credible leads.
I see. Let me ask you this. How long have you been on the police force?
33 years.
And in that 33-year time period, have you come across a gentleman by the name of Jeffrey Jenkins?
Yes.
How do you know Jeffrey Jenkins?
I arrested Mr. Jenkins several years ago on assault charges.
And what were the circumstances surrounding that assault charge?
The victim claimed that he had been roughed up by Mr. Jenkins, who was trying to collect a gambling debt.
Last question. Did you find any relationship between Coach Randy Johnson and the loan shark Jeffrey Jenkins during the course of your investigation?
Yes, we found Mr. Jenkins' number saved on Coach Johnson's cell phone, but there were no messages or texts between the two.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Sir, you may step down. The prosecution can call its next witness.
Prosecution rests, Your Honor.
Please state your name.
Susan Johnson.
Ms. Johnson, did you have a relationship with Randy Johnson?
Randy's my ex-husband. We were married for almost 12 years.
And what was the reason for the divorce?
Well, Randy had a habit of betting on sports. At first it was nothing, but he started betting more and losing more too. I thought we were going to lose the house. I asked him to stop, pleaded with him, but he wouldn't. One day, I came home to find he'd sold my car. I couldn't take it anymore.
What reason did he give for selling your car?
He told me he had to, or Jeffrey Jenkins and his guys would break his legs. Randy owed them a lot of money.
Ms. Johnson, did these men ever make a threat against Randy's life?
I believe so, yes. I saw a text message on Randy's phone from Jeffrey that said he better pay up or he wouldn't live to bet on another game.
At any point, did you fear for your life?
All the time. I worried that those guys would come after me and my girls.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. No more questions, Your Honor.
Your witness.
Ms. Johnson, my condolences on the loss of your ex-husband. How long have the two of you been divorced?
It's been 3 years.
Well, 3 years is a long time, Ms. Johnson. Isn't it true that you don't have any knowledge as to whether or not your ex-husband continued doing any gambling or not since your divorce?
Well, I guess. I guess I don't.
And in fact, in the 3 years after your divorce, you don't have any knowledge as to whether or not your ex-husband had any continued dealings with this Jeffrey Jenkins character or not, do you?
No, I don't know anything about that.
Well, thank you, Ms. Johnson. We appreciate you coming in. No further questions?
My name is Emmett Sullivan, and I'm a judge with the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, as well as a proud graduate of D.C.'s McKinley Tech High School. Jurors, the trial has concluded, and you now have two responsibilities. First, you need to decide the facts. Based on the evidence in this case, what really happened the night of September the 14th after the Panthers football game? Second, you need to decide whether the government has proven that Stephen Reynolds is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Reynolds does not need to prove his innocence. Reasonable doubt is doubt for which you have a reason based upon the evidence or lack of evidence in the case. If, after careful, honest, and impartial consideration of all the evidence, you can say that you are firmly convinced of Mr. Reynolds' guilt, then you must find him guilty. On the other hand, if you cannot say you are firmly convinced of his guilt, then you have a reasonable doubt and you must find him not guilty. Your verdict must be unanimous, meaning all jury members must agree on it. The United States Constitution guarantees the right to trial by jury, and the District of Columbia depends on people like you to serve as jurors and administer justice in our community. The case is now in your hands. You may commence your deliberations. Good luck.